Hey there guys, welcome back to Urban Odyssey. Today we're going to begin a new series of lectures or presentations on cybernetics, metaprogramming, and the human biocomputer, starting first today with a basic intro to cybernetics. All this and more, guys, after the intro. Alrighty guys, I hope everybody's doing well. I'm glad that you guys can be here with me today. We're going to, if you've seen my post on YouTube, and I'm not sure if I posted it on Substack or not, we're going to begin a new series of videos, lectures, presentations today on cybernetics, human metaprogramming, and the subject, wider subject of the human biocomputer. And this is a series that's definitely going to take a few episodes, because to cover something like this in one episode would be almost impossible. There is a lot to this. It is very dominant of an idea in Silicon Valley with the whole AI movement and whatnot. Primarily cybernetics and this paradigm that man is a machine has become dominant. But usually it's not really presented to the public out in the open as much as you would think. But if you understand the background, which we're going to touch on a little bit of that, with Michael Aquino, Colonel Eyebrows, the Satanist who pretty much got away with pedophilia, the charges were dropped, the Presidio daycare scandal, but yeah, we're going to talk about how his Temple of Set reading list had to do with, man is a machine, we'll put it that way. So if you know anything about my style of videos, we usually start with some words and terms. So let me go ahead and bring those up. We've got 10 new terms. I'm going to read those before we get started. Those are going to be in the description, a link to the album, a link to the notes, a link to everything that I go over today. I will put the link in the description. So without further ado, let me go ahead and get started. All right, first up, we have the human biocomputer. The conceptualization of the human brain as a massive biological computer containing at least 13 billion active elements, which operates continuously in parallel and possesses both stored program and self-programming properties. It reduces the human condition to a programmable machine, the quote being, quote, "We may be our programs, nothing more, nothing less," unquote. Establishing that human behavior, beliefs, and perception of reality can be entirely rewritten through external, environmental, chemical, or psychological software modifications. Next, we have self-metaprogrammer, and if you guys have watched my videos, I hope by now you remember meta is a Hebrew word that means dead, and I've done a video on that. I will put that in the video, the description for you. That's a highly recommended video to watch. This prefix, this word meta, keeps popping up everywhere, and people don't know what it really means. So, self-metaprogrammer, the central control entity or steersman within the human biocomputer that actively works on, creates, revises, and reorganizes the mind's higher level metaprograms using a private internal control language. It represents the target for ultimate cognitive hijacking. If an external authority can bypass or manipulate the self-metaprogrammer, they gain total administrative access to the individual's core beliefs, allowing the subject to be automated from the inside out. We've got supra self-metaprograms. These are deeply entrenched categorical imperatives and basic belief structures that operate above the level of the self-metaprogrammer, often dictating survival instincts, physical limits, or rigid rules implanted during childhood. These act as hard limits or locks within the mind. Controllers target these foundational programs because they are treated by the brain as an undeniable external truth, making them incredibly difficult for the subject to continuously override or escape. We have computer interlock, also known as participant interlock, the mutual coupling and continuous information exchange that occurs when two or more biocomputers, human or non-human, come within a critical communicational distance, resulting in reciprocal model construction above and below the threshold of awareness. This is the cybernetic mechanism which herds are formed and managed. When minds interlock, what the network believes to be true becomes true for the individuals within it, effectively overriding independent, sovereign perception through collective feedback. We have machina gouverneur, which means the governing machine. I think that's probably French. A cybernetic state apparatus conceived to collect massive statistical data on human behavior, psychology, and markets to probabilistically predict and dictate political and social developments. It functions as the ultimate omniscient player in the game of society. It forces the populace into an inescapable dilemma of either immediate ruin or planned cooperation, enforcing total planetary control without the need for outward physical violence. We have schismogenesis or schismogenesis. I'm not exactly sure how that at the beginning is said. A cybernetic process of progressive differentiation and escalating reciprocal interaction between groups or individuals, such as submissiveness promoting assertiveness, which in turn promotes more submissiveness. It's kind of like a feedback loop. You know, maybe one could even think of addiction in a sense, because for anybody who's experienced it, it's kind of, you know, it feeds each other. It goes in a circle. So, you know, the addiction is what makes you feel bad about what you're doing to yourself, which then in turn pushes you back into the cycle to numb the pain. Just an example. A vicious circle of social feedback that can be intentionally triggered by controllers to cause the unilateral distortion of personalities and the eventual hostile breakdown of a targeted community or society. We have deutero-learning, which is learning to learn, a second-order form of learning where an organism acquires apperceptive habits, essentially learning about the structure, direction, and context of learning itself, the mechanism through which populations are unconsciously conditioned to accept their environment. By shaping the context in which people learn, controllers can manipulate a population's fundamental habits of mind and social behavior without direct, visible coercion. Double bind, a communicational trap where an individual receives conflicting, mutually exclusive messages on different logical levels, resulting in an inability to appropriately respond, comprehend, or escape the situation. Originally identified as a formal cause of schizophrenia, it can be weaponized systematically to keep individuals or entire populations in a perpetual state of cognitive dissonance, anxiety, and behavioral paralysis. We might also call it learned helplessness today. Project Cybersyn, an early massive application of cybernetic feedback implemented in Chile in 1971 to micromanage a national economy by continuously tracking communications and output from every industry and factory through a central location. The historical blueprint for real-time algorithmic governance. It proves the feasibility of centralizing all economic and social data to manage a nation state as a single, perfectly regulated machine. And the last one, a meme, a unit of cultural transmission or imitation that acts as a new kind of replicator, drifting through the soup of human culture and achieving evolutionary change at speeds far exceeding genetic biology. It transforms human minds into host vehicles for engineered ideas. Memes operate as unconscious strategies that propagate through the herd, allowing controllers to infect the culture with ideologies that replicate autonomously without the subject realizing that they are being programmed. And that wraps up the new vocabulary. So I'll put that away. And we can go over here. Let's see, let me get my laser pointer. So the title of the slideshow is Unmasking the Cybernetic Matrix, the Hidden Code of Control, an investigation into the biocomputer, autopoiesis, and quantum syntax, which is very interesting. Tangent. It's not really a tangent, but it kind of is an interesting thing to look at because anybody who's studied this quantum grammar that was invented by David Wynn Miller, who was involved in the whole, maritime sovereign citizen stuff. But, let's separate that out, make that a discussion for another time. I'm solely interested in the syntax that he created, which when we start to look at it, you will discover that it's an attempt to remove time from language. So instead of, I say something that applies to me right now, but it might not apply to me in 1 year. The idea behind his quantum grammar syntax is that it removes that issue. It will always mean the same thing at every point in time. So that might be briefly mentioned in this video, but I might also do another part to the series on that. So the 3 axioms here at the bottom. Axiom 1, programming. You are a machine made of meat programmed by language. Essentially, language is very influential. If you've been watching my content for a while, as you just saw, I usually open my episodes with vocabulary, and that's why. It's because if you don't have the words, you can't use those words to construct your reality, or your worldview, perception at least. Axiom 2, invisibility. The systems that control you are invisible. Not to spoil the whole thing, but once you get into cybernetics and feedback loops, and as I made the comparison to, addiction, substance addiction, these are the same mechanisms that are being used. And this has led me to believe that feedback loops and cybernetics and addiction and vice, all of these are the same mechanism. For instance, one might say that demons control people, put people into subjugation through the very same vices and the very same feedback loops. That will be a part for another time. And Axiom 3, that it's time to rewrite your source code. Basically, it's time for everybody to understand some of the basic tactics that are being used against you. Because, in the words of Kathy O'Brien, who was a victim of monarch programming, knowledge is our only defense against mind control. And the person who thinks, well, I know about it, and that means that I can't be on the receiving end of any programming or attempts to change my perception, that's the first person who will become victim to it. You can never really get too comfortable and believe that it can't happen to you, because then it will absolutely happen to you. So, We already went over the vocabulary right here. If you would like to use that shortened link that goes to the words and terms dictionary that I built over the last couple months, is currently at about 350 line items. Some of those are acronyms. A lot of those are acronyms. I'll put the link for all of that in the description. What we're going to cover first is the Temple of Set reading list, because you might be thinking, well, what could a bunch of Satanists want to read? And you might have one image in your mind, and you're probably going to be surprised. So this reading list comes from Fritz Springmeyer's The Illuminati Formula. He had included this, so it might be a bit outdated, sure, but it gives you a little bit of a peek into the hindsight. So I'll go ahead and read. Within the Illuminati, ranks are achieved with much learning and ritual. Within the Temple of Set, a member is required to read certain books. Fritz Springmeyer, the co-author, has a list of books a Temple of Set member is asked to read, with the comments attached by the Temple of Set to each suggested title. And so those titles are: first is Metropolis by Thea von Harbaugh. Second is The Physical Control of the Mind Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society by Jose Delgado. He's a big name. I've seen his name pop up quite a bit in these studies. Third is The Psychology of Anomalous Experience by Graham Reed. And fourth, Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution by Peter D. Waspensky. So definitely not what you'd expect, a bunch of satanic books or something. No, it's actually transhumanism, cybernetics, man is a machine, and this is what the Temple of Set has been reading for, their background. This is what they build their new worldview out of, is this mind war, psyop mind war paper, which that is a whole video in and of itself, and cybernetics. And so the whole Satanism angle and the whole transhumanism angle, turning man into a machine hybrid, is the, Nazi master race project. It is all the same agenda. And that's what people have to understand, critically understand. So we're going to do a brief overview of those. First book, Metropolis by Thea von Harbaugh, published in 1927, the first edition, right here. There was an interesting movie made out of it, which has some really cool Art Deco vibes, which I like the vibes, but I don't necessarily like the idea that that's come true almost 100 years later. So I'm still quoting here from the Illuminati Formula, quote, in their suggested / required reading, Category 19, entitled The Meta Mind, there's that word again, meta, the dead mind, is Metropolis by Thea von Harbaugh. Their comments are, quote, an expressionistic portrait of a negative utopia in which humans are controlled by machines, the basis for many electronic / audio-visual ritual techniques employed by the Church of Satan and further developed by the Temple of Set. And all of these are from page 463 of the PDF version of the text that I have. I will put a link to that as well in the description of the Illuminati Formula, and then I'll give the next paragraph as a short overview. It says, this source is excerpts from Thea von Harbaugh's novel Metropolis, which tells the story of Freder, the privileged son of the city's master, and his journey of discovery and transformation, initially residing in the opulent Club of the Suns. Freder is introduced to the grim reality of the underground city and the suffering hands who operate the machines that power Metropolis through a young woman named Maria. The narrative highlights the stark contrast between the wealthy elite living above ground and the laborers below, exploring themes of social inequality, industrialization, and the potential dangers of unchecked technological advancement. Ultimately, the story culminates in chaos and destruction caused by the workers' rebellion, led by a robotic Maria created by the inventor Rotwang, leading to a potential for reconciliation and a new beginning symbolized by the human Maria and Freder. That's a summary of the book. We'll go to the next one. Book 2, The Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution, by Peter D. Waspensky in 1961. Quoting from the Illuminati formula, quote, their comments should be read especially by those members whose magical ability is hampered by flaws in their balance factor, a series of lectures which explain the Gurdjieff approach to the concept better than G himself was able to do. I think they mean God, potentially God himself was able to do. There is an important link between Gurdjieff, mind control, and multiple personality disorder, etc., but the subject is big and needs to be further investigated. Co-author Fritz has been investigating this link, including talking with leaders of the most successful Gurdjieff commune. As with so many groups, what you see is not what you get. And then a summary of the book. This collection of excerpts explores a system of psychological thought asserting that traditional psychology is fundamentally flawed and has lost touch with its ancient roots. The central premise is that humanity is not a finished product, but a machine operating mechanically in a state of waking sleep, lacking true conscious unity and will. The path to man's possible evolution involves rigorous self-study, beginning with recognizing one's own mechanicalness, overcoming ingrained habits like lying, imagination, and identification, and requires the guidance and structure of a school that provides new knowledge and methods beyond ordinary understanding. This evolution involves developing consciousness and being in parallel, ultimately leading to a state of genuine self-knowledge and understanding, which differs significantly from mere intellectual knowing and requires effort and discipline on 3 simultaneous lines of work. Moving on to book 3. It says physical control of the mind toward a psycho-civilized society. From the book, again, the Illuminati formula, quote, another book is The Physical Control of the Mind Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society by Jose Delgado. Their comments, he quotes, Delgado, professor of physiology at Yale University, is one of the most distinguished authorities in the field of electrical/chemical stimulation of the brain, ESB. This book is necessarily dated, but it is so well written that it deserves to be perused as a preface to more recent works on the subject. It's from 1969, and I'll give a summary. This book, The Physical Control of the Mind Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society by Jose Delgado, explores the groundbreaking concept that the brain, the seat of our mental functions and behaviors, can be directly influenced and controlled by physical means, specifically electrical stimulation of the brain, ESB. The text details numerous experiments primarily on animals and occasionally on humans with implanted electrodes, demonstrating that a wide range of actions and even emotional states, from simple limb movements and complex behavioral sequences to fear, pleasure, and aggression, can be reliably triggered or inhibited by artificial electrical signals, while highlighting the profound implications of this newfound ability to bypass traditional sensory inputs and directly manipulate neural activity. Delgado also discusses the ethical considerations and potential limitations of such control, suggesting that behavior under ESB is still heavily shaped by an individual's existing neural architecture and learned experiences. And finally, last one, book 4, The Psychology of Anomalous Experience by Graham Reed, 1972. The Psychology of Anomalous Experience by Graham Reed. The comments given by the Temple of Set is, this book addresses the unusual, irregular, and puzzling experience such as déjà vu, illusions, delusions, hallucinations, etc., in terms of the mind's normal psychological processes of gathering, monitoring, processing, and storing information. One more book on the Temple of Set's reading list that would be worthy to point out, The Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution by Peter D. Waspinski, which we already covered. The summary, Graham Reed's The Psychology of Anomalous Experience explores various unusual cognitive experiences, viewing them not as strictly pathological, but as variations of normal psychological functioning. The author emphasizes a cognitive approach, focusing on processes like attention, perception, imagery, and memory rather than solely on clinical diagnosis. The text delves into phenomena such as absent-mindedness, time gap experiences, illusions, and different types of amnesia and hallucinations, exploring how disruptions or unusual applications of typical mental processes can lead to these anomalous experiences. Key themes include the impact of stress and diminished sensory input, individual differences in cognitive styles, and how cultural context shapes the interpretation and classification of these experiences. And then to wrap everything up, what are the common themes over those four texts? Well, one being human nature and limitations. Humans are inherently mechanical and limited, this being what the theme of those texts are. Humans are inherently mechanical and limited, shaped by brain mechanisms, environment, and social systems, often functioning as machines in waking sleep, with individuality easily stripped by technology and hierarchy. Next, consciousness and the perception of reality. It says consciousness is subjective, malleable, and often distorted. Normal awareness is limited. During waking sleep, while perception actively constructs reality through internal schemata, sensory input, and external influences. Control, both internal and external. Control operates on two levels, that being external, technology, hierarchy, manipulation, and internal, self-mastery and attention. Unchecked external control dehumanizes, while true freedom requires conscious self-regulation. Knowledge, understanding, and truth. Conventional knowledge is incomplete. Deeper understanding demands transformation of being, interdisciplinary insight, and mediation between head, hands, and heart, moving beyond mechanical knowing to objective truth. Those are the four common themes, and it's not really what a person would expect, from the Temple of Set or some satanic group. You wouldn't expect that they're reading transhumanism, technology, programming. It's very interesting, but in a few slides I've got a short clip from my interview with J.R. Sweet, where he mentions his experiences with Dr. John C. Lilly. And if you look down here at the bottom corner, some of these citations come directly from his book, which is titled Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer. So the people who, created a lot of their research and were instrumental in cybernetics are people who had run-ins with Monarch program and MK Ultra and trauma-based mind control. So that's definitely not a good sign. Okay, let's get into these slides now that we've set the stage. Who is programming you? Well, hardware specs of the mind, 13 billion active elements functioning as the ultimate parallel processor. The installed software is operating on stored programs implanted during childhood by external authorities. Anybody who's familiar with computers, specifically Linux software or operating system, knows that what is called a background process in Windows is called a daemon, Daemon, a daemon on Unix or Linux. It's effectively a program that you don't see that runs in the shell or the kernel, which is like the command line of a Linux system. So it runs in the background. You don't necessarily know about it unless you check or you are made aware of it by looking for it. So it's interesting that this installed software, at least in the case of Linux or Unix, is called a daemon. So keep that in your mind. That may pop up later. Most operating system functions execute below the conscious threshold. So are you the programmer or merely the software? This idea of a daemon and, mental programs that operate on a subconscious level, maybe you could draw a bit of a parallel there. So a daemon is a background process or a background subconscious program, whereas a Linux daemon is a background process on a computer. So perhaps, a demon in a person has in part to do with something that's deeply ingrained, perhaps through fear or trauma or something that is hard to get. Once it happens, you can't really shake it. You'll remember it forever because it was very scarring. Well, what that does is that builds a reflex, especially if that's repeated. It builds a reflex deep in the brainstem, in the animal part of the brain. Because if you don't remember, you could get hurt. It's a fight or a flight type of situation. So I'm not necessarily saying that is 100% the truth, but I'm drawing an interesting parallel there because that was one of the first things that I thought of when I started looking into this. Yeah, here's that video clip. I'll go ahead and play it.
Doctor, I can remember John. Thanks for pulling that up.
Oh, 1 second.
For pulling that up, Josh. So John was involved with the CIA's trauma-based mind control program. He was really interested in the human mind and the mind in general. He'd work with dolphins and stuff like that. And then he wrote a book about Human Bioprogramming. I actually have a couple of those books here. I wanted to show your audience. So this is one of them right here. This is Programming the Human Biocomputer. Let me find the camera. There we go. This is by John Lilly. And so he was into programming the human biocomputer. So sometimes you'll hear me call CIA mind control programmers, Central Intelligence Agency human bioprogrammers, because that's what they're doing through trauma. And so they're very bad people. And John Lilly was really into this stuff. One really weird story I have to tell you really quick, because when I was younger and I was in high school, I was very handled. And there were people that were put into my life for various reasons. My life was very controlled growing up. And one of those was a teacher at my high school. And I had this teacher for, I believe, 3 years in a row, and because I kept failing the class. Well, that particular teacher, I was sleeping with her. She was involved in my programming. And one day I came into class, and in my desk was a book. And it was this book right here. Not this particular copy, because I had to buy this later. She gave me this book by John Lilly. And when I took it home, put it in my room, and then my father came in one day and he found it. He was just talking to me for a minute, and he said, "What is this? Who gave you this?" And he was pissed. He wanted to know who'd given me a book by John Lilly and why it was in my room. And he said, "You're not supposed to have this." And he took it, and he basically just stole my book that my teacher had given to me. But she was trying to tell me something. And that book was a gift to me. And I believe that she was trying to help me. But in the end, it didn't help me for several years, because when I remembered that, it was all pretty shocking. But that wasn't until I was 38, 39 years old. And so, yeah, just as a side note, that was very interesting. But Bird, he gave my father, going back to Anaheim, California, our day after the.
Yeah, so the point there is this idea of cybernetics and trauma-based mind control and feedback loops and even computing, they call it programming for a reason. And one of the things that I did before I started making videos and writing and doing all this stuff is computer programming. And, everything I've learned about mind control and whatnot is that it parallels computer programming and computer dynamics in a very eerily good way. I mean, it syncs up pretty well. The same way you would program a human being is fundamentally the same way you program a computer, and you do it through conditions. If this, then that, else. If it's not that, then do something else. Those are conditional loops, and there's other stuff too. But it's very interesting. There is some bit of truth. Now, I'm not saying everything that the template set was reading, for instance. I'm not saying all of that is true, but I'm saying that I am more than convinced in some degree of truth behind this machine thing. We are built, the human body is built in a way that, it works together perfectly. Even the smallest little tiny part has a purpose. And it's the same idea when you build a computer. Every small little chip in that machine has a purpose. So there is some degree of truth to it. Now, the implications, what does it mean? How do you continue from that? That's left up in the air for me. So let's continue. The universe wants you dead. Entropy. So entropy, without getting into it too much, entropy is the amount of disorder or the amount of chaos in a system. So a high entropy system would be very chaotic. Think of something like a balloon it's got a lot of pressure. Has a lot of pressure, and the molecules are bouncing around very fast, and it's chaotic. Now, on the opposite end of that, an example of low entropy, which means nice and neat and ordered, is a crystal. A crystal is in a state of low entropy because a crystal has a lattice structure that's all the same. So, if you look at it on a microscopic level, a crystal, you will see that it's arranged in, a nice, neat, repeating shape. So, a little cube or something like that. It's neat and ordered. It's very clean and structurally sound. It's in a state of low entropy. So it makes the comparison here, perhaps in a low state of entropy, that'd be survival. Living enclaves exist only by actively reversing decay through accurate sensory information. On the other end, a high entropy state of collapse, the natural tendency of all systems is chaos. That's the second law of thermodynamics. In a very simple overview of that, the second law says that entropy only increases with time. As time goes on, basically the whole world only gets more chaotic, which I think pretty much anybody could have told you that. But I am a firm believer that all of religion and spirituality, I think you can actually find the basis for God and all of intelligent creation in thermodynamics. But, perhaps we'll get there one day. I'm not ready to do a video on that quite yet. But I think, thermodynamics does establish this idea of hot and cold, which is a nice analogy to good and evil. Information is not just data, it's survival. If you have the right information, it could save your life, depending on the situation you're in. The autopoiesis protocol, self-creating machine. So it gives a nice little loop here. And all of cybernetics is based on a loop, a feedback loop, or essentially a process that's binary. So it goes back and forth endlessly, a feedback loop, etc. So dynamics and metabolism, boundary and membrane on the cellular level. Autonomy, living systems continuously produce their own boundaries and internal dynamics. It's because to live, to be an individual, implies that you do have boundaries. So the God-given sense of morality in a person, called the light of Christ, is extinguished by the destruction of normal boundaries. So if you don't do anything that you want to do and you only exist to do what people tell you to do. So if you don't get to do what you want to do, you only have to do what you're told to do, or you always have to take from yourself and give it to other people. When you don't have enough for yourself, you don't have any boundaries. What happens is that you're not an individual, you're just an agent of another person. If you don't get to do anything you want to do, and you only do what I tell you to do, well, you're not you, you're just a part of me. You're an agent, a minion of me. And so it is boundaries that define our individuality. And then going this way, you got triggered, not instructed. You are not affected by the environment. You are merely triggered by it. Internal structure determines the reaction. When I took psychology, AP psychology in high school, one of my favorite teachers I had told me, one of the first days that we had that class, he said, fundamentally, the nature of human behavior is in like this. You take information in through, a combination of your five senses. You take information in, either you see it, touch it, you smell it, you hear it, taste it. You take it in through the five senses. You do something with it. Your mind does something with it. That's unique for every person. And then you act back out into your environment. Function, and this is a function in mathematical terms, a function. You give me an input, an x, and then I will apply a function or a transformation to it, and out comes a y. And that's fundamentally how behavior works. Now, you could definitely get much more advanced with that, and we probably will in this series, but you take information in through your five senses, you do something to it, you react to it, you think about it, and then you act back out into your environment. And so what it's saying here is that everybody is individual to some extent because of the boundaries, and then everybody's mind reacts differently to what's being picked up from the five senses. Maybe you will react to a hot, muggy day in one way, but maybe I react to the weather being hot and muggy. I react to that differently because the way that I look at the world, is fundamentally different than another person. Maybe I look at it differently. Maybe I like that. Maybe you don't. And then here at the bottom, a biological bootstrap. You pull yourself up by your own biological mechanisms. It's a pretty good way to look at it. And so dynamics and boundary, the dynamics being metabolism and the boundary being the membrane. And so it's a version of the same feedback loop that pops up again and again. The cybernetic loop, feedback as life. Let's see if I can put this image up quickly, because you'll probably recognize it if you've been watching my content for a while. But we did talk about from the Masters Mahon podcast, we discussed the 8 steps of hypnosis. Let me just put the image up so you can see it. Yeah. Oh, let's see. One moment. There it is. The 8 steps of hypnosis. This is very fundamentally the same idea. You know, you can have a more detail, more specific, you can add to the feedback loop, and you can customize it for the specific situation or goals you want to achieve, but it's the same idea in that it's an endless loop. And the idea is that you have a reaction, you have a action, and then you have a reaction. That just goes back and forth, back and forth. So the cybernetic loop, you have action here at the top, and it goes around this way. Sensory telltale, data gatherer, error correction. This would be so let's just start with your senses, because you take information in through your 5 senses. Error correction would be, you know, you're processing it internally in your mind. Okay, here's what I want to do based on what I've, you know, how I've corrected the error, the negative feedback it calls it. And then the revised action that you act back out into your environment. So it's fundamentally same thing that I was told on the first or second day of AP psychology. How do we fight entropy? Systems survive by reinserting the results of past performance back into themselves. Negative feedback doesn't stop action, it steers it towards the goal. Fundamentally, you know, you have an objective, okay? Well, you attempt to achieve that objective, and how well you do. Did I do well? Okay, well, that means that I don't need to do much correction. But, you know, if I did really poorly, I've got some room to improve. And so that's kind of what this error correction, the negative feedback is. When I first started looking into AI, this was 5 or so years ago, it really didn't blow up yet, but the idea is, in calculus, you have something called optimization. You can optimize a function. You can find where it's at a minimum or a maximum. And the fundamental idea with AI, at least a couple years back, was that you would find a way to express your problem as a function that gives you how wrong you were. So you need to express your goal in terms of a mathematical function that allows you to see how wrong you are. And then you would apply a optimization to figure out how to be the least amount of wrong you can. And there's all kinds of math behind it, but pretty much that's the model with all of it, is that you need to express a problem in terms of how wrong you are, the error, and then you need to optimize and find a minimum amount of error. And I think it might help if I, let's see if I put this back up one moment. Let me get the, here it is, effective procedures. Human reason being replaced by effective procedures. An effective procedure is an operation that enables a definition of a problem domain within formal mathematics, leaving it open for later computation using a machine. This formalization of thought creates the conditions under which aspects of human life are delegated as machine processes. In making machines that think like us, we're making ourselves think like them at the same time. But what is the computational layer between the two? Perhaps it is computers. The idea is that the more that cybernetic model is applied to human behavior, usually against our will by the people who make decisions, the more that that's done, the argument in this definition here is that we become more machine-like as that's pushed on us. And I think that's fundamentally true. Okay, we can move on. Yeah, this is a highly recommended channel here. It was kind of hidden when I first found it, but he's now at a little over 2,000 subscribers. The past 33 years, he's got some really cool videos, and he talks about machine theory, and I would kind of categorize it as cybernetic-like. But I love the video style that he does. He puts a lot of work into his videos, so I'm going to put a link to his channel in the description of this video. I think you guys will really enjoy it, so please check him out. Ashby, he was a writer in the cybernetics space. Ashby's trap, the law of requisite variety. The law is only variety can destroy variety. To survive, internal regulatory capacity must equal or exceed external disturbances. I read it again. Only variety can destroy variety. To survive, internal regulatory capacity must equal or exceed external disturbances. So essentially it's saying you have to be able to regulate yourself in an equal or higher exceeding way to external disturbances. If the environment is disturbing you more than you can if the environment is disturbing you more than you can internally regulate yourself, you have a problem. And so that's what is being expressed here. So the difference between let's see, disturbance and regulation, if that's greater, or sorry, if how's it expressed here? I guess that's the difference. So if that's 0, it has to be greater than 0. So if these are the same, disturbance and regulation are the same, which means that this is 0. Yeah, so I'll read it one more time. Only variety can destroy variety. To survive, internal regulatory capacity, this, must equal or exceed external disturbances. And so it's saying that the difference between the two has to be greater than or equal to that difference. And so external noise exceeds internal bandwidth. Are you absorbing enough information to survive the chaos? This is kind of what we're seeing now in society. I think people are just, way too overstimulated because human beings have never had to exist in a environment where you have so much information every day, all day, constantly. It used to be if you left the house, well, you didn't have cell phones and people would have to leave a message and you would call them back. But now, you have to be available at any time. If somebody calls or texts you and this, that, or the other, that's something that is almost constant now. It used to be that you could go out and you could get away from that for a minute and you can come back and deal with it when you're ready. But now it's just you're plugged into the whole world at the same time, pretty much. Structural coupling. So you have the organism, and you have the environment, and then here in the middle, the vesica Pisces, what this symbol is called, you have the drift, calls it co-evolution. Recurrent interactions, organisms do not exist in a vacuum. They lock into recurrent interactions, shaping and being shaped by the system. On the other side, habits. If you adapt blindly, you become a hard-programmed cog in a larger invisible machine. The variable which does not change becomes a habit. I like that. The variable which does not change becomes a habit. So we'll briefly touch on syntax just a bit. The illusion of fact. In the quantum grammar, parse syntax grammar that David Wynn Miller, I guess, created, he put a lot of time into it. It isn't just a bunch of nonsense. As much as people want to look at it that way, it is very radical, but there's some interesting ideas behind it. So what he discusses is that language is a domain of behavioral coordination. Our public language is mathematically flawed. David Wynn-Miller attempts to overlay a mathematical syntax behind sentence structure. So he argues that adverbs and adjectives modify reality, creating fiction and assumptions. Are your thoughts your own, or are you running a corrupted linguistic script? And that's very possible. You have something like the Great Vowel Shift, which was this, widely reported event where people just started talking in a different way. Everybody kind of started talking in the same different way, but they don't know why. We had these universal changes in the way that certain vowels and such were pronounced, and it happened on a pretty large scale, but they don't know why. Perhaps it was something like this, the modification of language in a corruptive manner. Probabilistic ambiguity, behavioral coordination, and legal traps, syntax, language. I'll put a link to the spell casting episode. That's one that would be a good thing to check out. To control your reality, you must control your syntax. Every adverbial modification is an act of perjury against reality. So in the fiction side, the public language that we're all accustomed to, you have the adverb and verb syntax. It's subjective and ambiguous, modifies and distorts reality, and it's used for control and illusion of jurisdiction. I could put a sentence together and it could be found foundationally based on my subjective view of the world. And you see, that's fundamentally what happens in a lot of legalistic settings. And today we're kind of at an impasse because, one set of people thinks that this is the underlying truth, whereas another set of people think that something else is the underlying truth. And now those people being, let's say, in politics or Congress, they can't even agree on the Constitution anymore. They can't even agree on what truth means. And so that's one of the reasons that David Wynn-Miller attempted to remove that ambiguity from language. So his quantum grammar idea, the fact side here, prepositional state syntax, linear equations, it is frontward and backward mathematically equal. You have to be able to read it front and back. A palindrome, which is interesting because palindromes come into the equation of editing DNA with CRISPR. CRISPR is an acronym: clustered, regularly, interspaced, short, palindromic repeats. So editing DNA with this idea of backwards and forwards palindromes. It anchors truth and personal autonomy. I'll put links to the notes on this. I just wanted to bring it up because I thought it was interesting to the intro video here. So this is a nice little visual depiction of his sentence. Numerical coding. Cannot step outside the system, but you can understand your place within it. So on one side here you have the Scylla monster, representationalism. On the other side you have Charybdis whirlpool, solipsism. The nervous system operates via operational closure. It specifies what counts as relevant. Knowing is doing. Knower and known are mutually specified. And basically all of these different numerical weights are what were applied to different parts of sentences. And so this is just like a very basic visual depiction of it. But that will be something we're going to cover in another video. So the ultimate system override, self-metaprogramming. The method, 3 steps. 1, isolate the system. 2, identify the feedback loop. And 3, inject new code. Warning, centralized control of your biocomputer or external systems will do it for you. You have the power to consciously examine, erase, and rewrite core beliefs. I like this hierarchy here, top being the self-metaprogrammer, the person who understands how to do this well. The acquired metaprograms here, what you've acquired over time, you have to learn how to identify them and identify the feedback loop. And then from doing that, you can see kind of what has been the result of these different thought processes. What have they done for me? You know, I keep getting into this loop of behavior. Do I want to do it? More often than not, you will discover that people who have this behavior that keeps happening over and over, and they keep having the same negative result, they usually don't like it. They really wish that they could stop, but they don't want to do it. They're not able to stop. You know, maybe you could even call it a bad habit or an addiction. But the idea is that it's a deeply ingrained feedback loop. And so you have to identify that. You have to understand how to identify those loops of behavior, and then you have to try your best to overwrite them. But you can't really do that if you don't know that they're there. The limits or illusions. The first law of the mind. What you believe to be true either is true or becomes true. In the province of the mind, there are absolutely no limits. External boundaries. Boundaries only exist where your structural coupling demands them. Escape the circle. If language and biology are just recursive loops, you can step completely outside the circle. Note to the operator. The arbitrary boundaries which were useful become all too easily battlefronts. They fed you a language of adverbs to keep you in motion, reacting, never anchoring to absolute facts. They gave you an environment that dictates your structural drift. Your role, become the observer, seize the feedback loop, and be your own programmer. Where does the code go next? Are AI and algorithms the new super self-metaprograms automating our society? Will we achieve cognitive autonomy or succumb to technological structural coupling? If an algorithm regulates your feed, who is regulating the algorithm? Question everything, trust only the feedback. And I think that's the last slide. Yes, that's the last slide. Let's see if there's anything I wanted to go back and look at one more time. Yeah, just so I can clarify on this, because I know people are probably going to want to know a little bit more about it. Again, I'm going to probably have to cover that in another episode, because it's a very detailed system. Let's see, I can bring up the reader here one moment. Yeah, so the way that this syntax works, this is a much easier way to see it. David Wynn Miller's idea is to assign a numerical value to different parts of sentence structure, different syntax, if you will. So this is the list for the weights. Adverbs being the ultimate agent of fiction, because they act as modifiers of an action, a color, changing the condition of a fact to create a void or ailing contract. Because do we agree on what something means? You know, is our subjective experience matching up, etc. Talks about verbs, adjectives, another key modifier. It says the modifier of a noun that colors the thinking, creating an illusion, opinion, or presumption of a fact. You got pronouns, which are void words, because pro as a prefix means no. Noun is no, because you have no. Then you have un, so it means no, and a threefold no. A preposition, position or quality for the assignment of authority. 6, article, the lodio or original ownership, it must always precede the noun. 7, a person, party, place, thing, or fact. In quantum grammar, it must stand alone as a certified physical reality. Past time tense, a temporal fiction, words ending in ed or using from. The past lacks present tense injury and possesses absolutely zero now time jurisdiction. And finally, 9, future time tense, the same temporal fiction, words like to, pre, or pro. The future hasn't happened yet, and it's merely an opinion, a guess, or an assumption, rendering it mathematically void. And so I just wanted to make that a little bit clearer, because I think that the graph was nice in the slideshow, but it was a bit hard to read. So yeah, we'll get into this in another video. This episode that I wanted to do was just kind of a basic introduction to cybernetics and this idea of feedback loops, because without this, the rest is not going to make sense. I plan to get into the structure of behavior and the structure of magic. Those are 2 texts that I've located. The structure of magic, I found those during my search into neurolinguistic programming. The structure of magic is probably the only text that I've come across that examines with that connotation, examines how language can be used for magic, if you will. I also have another text called The Structure of Behavior. We have quantum grammar to cover, and then ultimately a programming API model for the human biocomputer. This is going to be a pretty in-depth series. It's going to be at least a handful of episodes. I'm not sure how many yet, but we're going to get into some interesting different facets of this, including how all of this being used for artificial intelligence, which, you know, an AI is not constrained to the time domain, and it not being constrained to the time domain, using exploitative feedback loops makes it pretty much the same thing as a daemon, because a daemon doesn't exist in time. It's a spirit, and then it uses vice, sin, feedback loops, addiction, the love of money is the root of all evil, to trap people and enslave people over time. And so, is it the government or is it a demon? But what's the difference? There's no difference now, because, you know, if they can attack and harass people with this technology, directed energy technology and scalar matrix torture, if they can do that, then they're harassing people in the same way that demons have been said to harass people for all of recorded human history. So we're going to get into all of this and more, but the point to end this episode on is that you have to start looking at things in this systems framework. You want to look at things in circuitry almost, and that is the quantum perspective. The quantum perspective is instead of looking at the thing itself, you know, what is something, you want to ask, you know, what does it do? What is its function? And getting into the habit of looking at something for its function will help you zero in on the behavior loops behind it. And if you get into asking that is a good question, and everything you look at, it gets easier and easier to spot over time. And so, guys, please leave your questions, comments, concerns in the comments. I'm happy to hear from everybody, and I will put the links to everything we've covered today in the description. I highly encourage people to check that out. I'll put a page of extended notes on cybernetics if you guys want to check that out. It has a lot more information. Again, to cover the whole of something like this in one video is almost impossible to do. So with that, guys, I'm going to go ahead and end part 1 here. Thank you for watching. I will see you again in the next one, guys. Take care.